So a couple days ago, I did a video on mastering and publishing your music. I had a few comments about not using the Reaper stock plugins for that tutorial. So if that's what you guys want to see, using stock plugins for mastering, that's what we're going to do. And so let's just jump into it. The order of operations. Let's do a quick recap. First, imported the tracks, got them organized, figure out the track order, add some metering plugins so that you can see how loud it is, and then balance out the different levels. I use the item volume knob in that case to do that, but there's lots of different ways to adjust volumes in Reaper, and the idea is that you're adjusting that before it gets into the effects chain. But some other people will do that after. You could use the track volume after the effects chain. Doesn't really matter unless you're using like analog processing plugins where they need to be in at a certain level, but I'm not in this case. So I gain stage by boosting the levels usually at the beginning, and each song is going to have its own level that is right. Usually there I'm listening for the loudest section of the song, like the chorus or wherever there's the most busy section. And if I'm not looking at a VU meter, which is calibrated to -10 decibels, then I would be looking at a short-term LUFS meter, playing a few seconds of that and figuring out if that's the right level for that section. And if that's the right level, how does that compare to the previous and next songs? So after getting the levels right, we put on a master limiter, which helps keep things below -1 dBFS, which gives room for streaming headroom. If there's anything that's too loud, that gets pushed down by the limiter, and we need to make sure that we're not pushing things too loud so that the limiter is not working in its kind of transparent range. We did EQ, which helps balance the tonal differences between the different songs, corrects issues, and can kind of give an overall tone to the songs altogether. If we're doing any subtractive EQ there, that's going to reduce the level that's coming into the limiter, which means things like bass drops and things like that. If we're EQing some of the bass out, that's not going to overload the limiter. After that, we're doing multiband compression. I used an Ozone dynamics processor for that, but today we'll be using ReXComp, and that is one of the stock plugins. It's a multiband compressor. I find it a little more difficult to use, less interesting to look at, missing some of the features that I rely on in the Ozone modules. At the end of the day, you can get basically the same results. So after the multiband compression, I used some stereo widening tools to narrow the low end, or mono the low end. So the kick drum and things like that are not going back and forth between different speakers, and it just sounds a little more clear and punchy in the low end. There isn't like a tool for that built into Reaper, so we kind of have to do some messing around to get something similar to that, but I'll show you that later on today. And yeah, so that's the order of operations. It's usually loudness, limiting, EQ, and then any other issues that come up. Multiband compression is very common. Stereo widening or managing the stereo field in any way is very common, as well as saturation effects, exciting, dynamic EQs, and things like that. Whatever you need for the track, whatever tools you're comfortable with using, use them. Use the best tools that you have available. I think limiting yourself to stock plugins isn't always the best option, but you can get a good master using just stock plugins. And then I guess the last thing to mention is that it's not set and forget. We were going through that video very quickly just to get the 4 songs kind of in a roughly good spot. But in real life, in a real job, I would be listening to reference tracks. I would be spending a lot more time on the EQ and everything for each song, for everything as a whole, taking breaks, coming back to it later and listening at low levels and high levels, listening on headphones, listening on other speakers. All those things, they take time. It would be very boring in a video to watch that. You don't set it and forget. Once you get to the end of that processing chain, you go back to the beginning and you refine it. You're making sure that the level coming in is right. You're making sure that every EQ point is right, that you're not overloading your limiter. If there's a certain spot that's overloading the limiter, figure out why. Is that something that you can take care of with automation? Is that something you can take care of with EQ? So now that we're like 10 minutes into this, let's get started with the mastering. All right, so I'm going to open up Reaper's mixer, and on the master track, I've taken off the stealth limiter. In fact, I'll just remove it entirely. And then we'll put on a metering plugin. For this, we're going to use the new Loudness Meter plugin, which is right here, JS Loudness Meter Peak RMS LUFS. We're just going to put that into the master track. All right, so the peaks were above 0 +3, and that's because we don't have a limiter on this track yet. For the loudest section, this hit -11 for short-term loudness. The LUFS integrated level is not accurate because we didn't play the entire song. It's not taking into account the quiet intro and the less dense verses, things like that. So I'm not concerned about that number at this point. What we're basically looking for is like short-term LUFS at -11 in the loud part, sure. And then let's compare it to a different song. And so that different song ended up with a very similar short-term loudness. So there's the loudness meter, and the next thing in the list would be a limiter. So there are a few options for built-in limiter plugins that come with Reaper. JS Master Limiter, and you'll put this before the loudness meter. There's also the MGA JS Limiter, the stereo version. And there's also the new ReLimiter. At the time of recording this, not even released yet, but I'm going to hold on to this video until that's out. Where is that relimit? So this is the newest one. And so I'll just bypass all of them except for the first one. So this is one you may have seen before, JS Master Limiter. If I'm just going with like my default settings here, the threshold's at -2, which with the master limiter applies 2 dB of gain. And then the limit decibels or ceiling in most cases, I also want that at -1. So it's roughly not going to exceed -1. There are attack and look ahead and hold and release options, but just keeping things the same, because this is not a very tweakable plugin here. We're just going to see how this sounds with these sorts of settings. And in this case, I can hear that it's kind of ducking whenever the kick hits, which sounds kind of weird to me. This plugin uses a slider for the gain reduction meter, which is kind of weird, but the actual number here was about -3. So let's go on to the MGA JS limiter. I believe this is made by the same person. And we're going to set this the same way. So -2 for the threshold and -1 for the ceiling. That's sounding a little bit better to me. So here is the new ReLimiter. This one is resizable, which is nice, and it has a kind of a waveform history in it. So we're going to set this the same as always, -2 and -1. And what's interesting is you can see where and by how much it's actually working. These are kick drums. These kick drums are loud. These have a very quick attack that is getting through the limiter. How do we manage this without kind of ruining everything? How do we make it this limiter sound better overall? And how do we make it just not constantly working on those kick drums? Maybe we should go back and forth between the different compressors. Again, let's do the master limiter. I would say the master limiter sounds the worst. MGA JS limiter sounds pretty good. ReLimit sounds the best, or very, very similar to the JS limiter, but it's not audibly ducking or anything like that. It's not distorting either, which is good. So what I would like to do here is just add in the JS soft clipper in here. And with the soft clipper, and we'll brick wall at, actually brick walling at 0 should handle this. Let me pop out these two plugins. So with the soft clipper, not doing anything really, but it is in itself a hard limiter. It won't pass anything past 0. And because we know that the peaks of this we're hitting about +3, it should be able to shave off some peaks so that the limiter plugin is doing very little, which should clean up the sound. And as long as it's not pushing things too much, it should be pretty clean, actually. And at worst, adding a little bit of saturation to those peaks that are shaving off. Now, obviously that's too far, but even setting this to like -1 or so, so it's adding just a slight bit of saturation to the to everything. And if we're comparing other limiters, there's also Event Horizon soft clipper, and so we'll replace the JS soft clipper with JS Event Horizon. Now this is essentially a master limiter as well, but this one doesn't have any gain reduction meters. So threshold at -1. Ceiling at -1, and I will A/B compare these two plugins. So Event Horizon limiter first. It's kind of subtle. I feel like I can hear a bit of saturation happening with the soft clipper. Maybe you don't want that. I think I actually don't want that. So Event Horizon limiter, which is also a soft clipper, is something that you can put on right before your master limiter, and that will either distort it more, which we don't want, or it will shave off the peaks cleanly if it reacts fast enough without overdriving. So that's the loudness section. EQ, we're going to leave it the same. This is the EQ that we used in the last video and sounds right, we'll say, for this. Moving on to multiband compression, we can use one of the Kako's stock plugins, which is ReXComp. I've got a mastering starting point, which is 3 bands. First band is at 0 to 254. Band 2 is 254 to 3,517. And band 4 is from 3,517 up to 24K. Thresholds are at about -12 each, and using a 2-to-1 ratio. This multiband compressor doesn't have that auto learn function that I really like about the Ozone modules, but it does have solo, which is really nice. So we can listen to just the low end, listen to just the mids, listen to just the highs, and we can add in more bands as needed. But it doesn't have the option of linking all the controls. We can't adjust the gain or the threshold or the ratio of all 3 at the same time, which makes it a lot slower to work with, which is something that makes me not want to use it in the mastering context. All right, so let's hear it. I'll bypass it. So it's just kind of doing its thing fairly cleanly, taking away some of the things just in those moments when it's happening. So up to 2 dB on the low end, 0.1 or 2 on the other bands. This is my starting point, but often just putting that on there kind of cleans things up. It's only a 2-to-1 ratio, so it's not too extreme. Pretty transparent. Yeah, feel free to use something similar to that, or spend as much time as you need to adjust and fine-tune things. All right, so now the stereo balance. This is something that is going to be a little trickier. If you don't understand mid-side processing, this will probably just go right over your head. Use the Ozone Imager. It's actually a free plugin. It's a very good plugin. And then there's many other plugins that can do this. Basically, you want to narrow the low end so that it's not distractingly going back and forth. I find that just like the kick drum and the bass just sounds more punchy and things. So I like to do that. The way we're going to fake it this time is to set up a MidSide Matrix, put in an EQ on the side channel, and cut the lows from the side channel, which means we need a MS encoder. So if we just search for MS, it's JS MidSide encoder. And then we need a decoder right after that. And a EQ. So we'll use ReEQ again. And that's going right between the 2 different encoder and decoder plugins. We don't have to adjust anything on the encoder or decoder plugins themselves. We do need to go into the pin connector and disconnect input 1 and output 1. We want to pass through the left channel or the mid after it's gone through the encoder, and only adjust the sides. So only what's different between the left and right. And by EQing out some of the lows, we're making it less different in the left and right, which kind of brings it back into the center. It's not the ideal way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but without a dedicated stereo width plugin, this is one way you can do it. This EQ should only work on what's different in the left and right channels. And if we take anything away, that should kind of shift it towards what's similar and only in the center. So let's hear this. You can hear as I do this, it's bringing it more towards the center, making it more mono. So now it's mono. I could also increase the width of the highs. A very powerful and cool effect, but we want to use this pretty subtly, so let's do -6 below, let's say 150 hertz. Barely noticeable, but if you're in good headphones or if you've got a subwoofer, you should be able to feel that that is a little more defined in the low end. Kind of annoying that it is 3 plugins to do something that's normally 1 slider in Ozone 9 Imager. You also don't have the ability of soloing that or anything like that. It's just a little bit annoying, but it is possible to do the same sort of effect. Yeah, so that's essentially the same mastering job that I did in the previous video, but using just the stock plugins. The way that I master things is pretty gentle, I would say. I'm not doing anything too drastic to change the sound of anything. I do often use saturation plugins, but I honestly wouldn't trust any of the built-in stock plugins to provide the what I would need. I'm a big fan of the Ozone Exciter module because you can do it multiband, and you can have like tape saturation on your low end, console saturation in the high end, tube saturation in the mids, and dial in the perfect amount and flavor, and even do mid-side processing for each of the bands. It's pretty incredible what you can do. It would just be so complicated to set that up with stock plugins, and it would just you would easily add an extra hour of work to whatever you're doing. And the longer you spend on a project, the less objective you can be. Working quickly, using tools that are familiar and powerful, that's what makes mastering interesting for me. So I hope this has been helpful, answered some of the questions about whether you can use Reaper stock plugins for mastering or not. Now you know some of the plugins that you can use, and some ideas for A/Bing or what to listen for and things like that. Hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Support the Reaper blog through Patreon, and visit reaperblog.net for a lot more tutorials.